Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. Humans are not assets. Kalu חיציו. Daf Gimel is Shabbos's daf. Shabbos is Yud Beis Kislev, the 12th of Kislev, which is my father's Yortzeit. My mother's Yortzeit is Rosh Chodesh Teves, a little bit later. So I've dedicated this year Ilui Nishmatam, Adoni Avi Mori, Rabbi Avram Chaim ben Rabbi David, and Imi Merosi, Maras Maria, Bas Rabbi David Halevi. Their neshamas have aliyot in the schut of all the Torah that all of you are learning, which is based on all the Torah that I've learned, which is based on all the Torah that my father taught me and the direction in which they set us. So here we're dealing with the comment that you often hear in business: people are our most valuable assets. Have you ever heard that? And whenever anybody tells me that, I tell them, why don't you at least be honest? If I could offer you a business where you didn't need any people, that you could keep up the same revenue, the same growth, no people. You just come into the office every morning, you turn on a program, and you go home. You don't have to manage it. Are you going to tell me you wouldn't do that? Because people are your most valuable assets. How would you have a business without people? People are a nuisance. They're not a valuable asset, they're a nuisance. It's just that you need them. And there's a difference between people and assets. An asset is something which is unproductive unless a human acts on it. You have an asset that doesn't do anything. You've got a machine, you've got a car, you've got money in the bank. Nothing happens unless a human being applies intellect or energy to the asset. Then the asset is productive. That means a human being is not an asset. A human being is he or she who acts on an asset. And if you treat human beings as assets, then you don't harvest their productivity at all, because assets on their own are not productive. And we'll see this as foundational to the piece of Gemara that we're going to learn. So Rava says, Kashile la Abaya. My Chavrusa Abaya had a question, and the question was the following. You know that we've learned that Eish, the nezek of Eish, of fire, has two dimensions to it. It's treated by Reish Lakish as mamono, as something which belongs to you. The fire is yours, you created, you lit it, you've got to take care of it. And Rabbi Yochanan, who says that's not the reason you're chayiv. The reason you're chayiv is because it's an extension of you. It's like a weapon that you've used to achieve a certain aim. It's like a person shoots a bullet and causes damage, or fires a bomb and causes damage. It's not because he owns the bomb that is chayiv because it was an extension of Odom HaMazik. This is human damage. This is not Momen HaMazik. This is not an asset causing the damage. This is a human causing the damage. That's the machlokes. Achsabaya, according to the mandom Ishum Mishum Chitzov, that is Rabbi Yochanan, Tomun be'esh tepoter rachmana hechem ishkachat. We have another din in Eish, unique to Eish. And that is, if something is hidden in the field, not visible, I'm not chayiv for it. I'm not obligated. So I have my famous barbecue that we had yesterday. I go to sleep without putting the fire out. The fire breaks out, extends, the wind blows it to my neighbor's field. And it destroys my neighbor's field. The next day my neighbor comes to me with his lawyer, not just with one lawyer, but he comes with 6 lawyers. And he sits down in my house and he says, you owe me $30 million. And I say, for what? Your corn in your field? That's not worth anywhere near that. It's worth very little. He says, but you didn't know. In the shed, in the field, was a Rembrandt that I used to keep there. And I said, how am I supposed to know that? Had I known that there was a Rembrandt in the neighboring field, I would have been much more careful with the fire. So that's called tamun. It's hidden in the field. I couldn't have known. And I'm patur. It's a valid claim. Asks Abaya a wonderful question. He says, in mamon hamazik, when my assets cause damage, my ox or whatever causes damage, then we understand there are certain leniencies. But it could have been predicted, couldn't have been predicted. Was it in my territory, or was it in your territory, or was it in Rishus Harabim? There are all sorts of nuances to determine the level of my culpability. But Adam HaMazik is Adam Muad Lo Olam, as you were saying yesterday, Rabbi, right? Adam is Muad Lo Olam. He can never use excuses for anything. A human being has no excuses. That's what's interesting. That's what Adam Muad Lo Olam means. A human being has no excuses, except real onus. This was beyond my control. But instinct is not an excuse. And to say, I didn't know, lack of knowledge is not an excuse. If Eish is because of חיציו, that means it's Odom HaMazik, it's human damage. Why should I be potter because I didn't know there was a Rembrandt there? That's not a reason to be potter. Says, Rova v'nichale, and my Chavrusa Abaya answered his own question. כגון שנפלה דלקה לאותו חצר ונפלה גדר שלא מחמת דלקה והלכה והדליקה והזיקה בחצר אחרת. The case there was, where Talmud applies, is where when I lit the fire, there was a barrier between my field and my neighbor's field. There was a big wall there, the fire couldn't have gone across. But after I lit the fire and I went to sleep, the wall came down. There was a big wind, the wall came down. So at the time of my lighting of the fire, dahatam kalule חיציו, I had no more arrows in my bow, because the fire couldn't have gone that far. Now that fits in very nicely with the Nemuchi Yosef, which I bring it here at the bottom, which we learned yesterday, where the Nemuchi Yosef says, at the time of lighting the fire, or of being careless with the fire, as Tosfos said, that in the case of fire, even just carelessness, carelessly removing the protection around something damaging is in itself the initiation of damage. If I have radioactive material encased in lead and I remove the casing, that's all I do. I don't touch the radioactive material, I just remove the casing. That's pshia. That means I've unleashed the destructive energy. So it is with fire. So the moment I do something careless with this fire, I'm responsible then at that moment for everything that happens afterwards, said the Nemuchi Yosef. But here, what can happen afterwards? At the time I lit it, it couldn't have gone to my neighbor's property. It could only go to my neighbor's property after the wall comes down. But what is the moment we look at? We don't look at the moment of combustion, we look at the moment of ignition. And at the moment of ignition, it couldn't have gone that far, so it's not chetz. And therefore, says the Gemara, so that's not only tamun, which should be patur, not only the hidden Rembrandt, I should be potter for, I should be potter for everything, because at the time I lit, the fire had no destructive capacity as far as you were concerned. So why am I chayev at all? That brings the Gemara to an amazingly important conclusion. Ela, leman de itle mishum chitzav, itle nami mishum mamono. This is not an either-or. This is not Rabbi Lakish says it's mamono, and Rabbi Yochanan says it's chitzav. Rabbi Yochanan says, of course it's mamono as well. He just adds, but where chitzav applies, where you can add a layer and say this is not only your asset doing the damage, it is also you doing the damage, the human being doing the damage, then we do apply that human factor. In the case of Eish, which we don't do with other Nezikin. So it's an added layer according to Rabbi Yochanan. It's not a binary option. Is it Momon or is it Odom HaMazik? No, says Rabbi Yochanan, it is Momon and Odom HaMazik. So the Gemara then goes on to say, well then what difference is there between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, which we won't go into now. A few daf ahead, in Daf Chavtes, we have the famous Gemara from Psochim, Daf Vov, where Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, Shnei dvarim einan birshut birshuto shel adam v'sa'an hakatuv ki'ilu hein birshuto. There are two things which don't belong to people, and the Torah regards it as if they do. It's a ki'ilu. The Torah says this doesn't belong to you, but I'm treating it as if it does. Ve'elu hein, these are they. Bor birshut harabim. You dig a bor in Rishus Harabim. You dig a hole in the Rishus Harabim, a trench, or you put something in Rishus Harabim in the public domain that can cause people to trip up. So there's a takala. You've put something damaging in the public domain, and even if it's not yours, it's not your thing. The bor, the pit is not yours. You just dug it, and it's in Rishus Harabim. Rishus Harabim's public domain. It's not your domain. The Torah says, "I'm treating it as if it is yours. You are obligated." And the other one is chametz mishesh sha'ot u'lamala. After 6 hours on Erev Pesach, the chametz no longer belongs to you. It's an isur hana'ah. You're not allowed to have benefit from it. If you're not allowed to have benefit from it, it's not yours. If it's not yours, how can you transgress ba'al yeroi and ba'al yimotzeh? So the Torah says, it's not yours, but I'm treating it as it's yours. Those are the two cases where the Torah says, this does not belong to you legally, but from the point of halacha, I'm treating it as if it's yours. Asks Rabbi Chonan Wasserman in Kovet Shurim, why not add Eish according to Tosfos? You'll remember there was a machlokes Tosfos and Rashi yesterday. Rashi said this, that Reish Lakish, and now we know it's Rabbi Yochanan as well, says that Eish is mamono, is only if the coal belongs to you. At least the coal, the burning wood, the fuel you used in your barbecue must belong to you. But if it doesn't belong to you, how can it be mamono? But Tosfos says no, it can be. No matter what fuel you're using, it's not about the ownership of the physical embers burning in the barbecue. It's about ownership of the fire that you made. And by making the fire, it is yours, says Tosfos. Ask Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman, so this is a third case of something which isn't yours, because what did Rabbi Yochanan say yesterday on Daf Chav Beis? Rabbi Yochanan says that's ein boi mamash. This is not tangible, and therefore it can't be mammon, said Rabbi Yochanan. That's why I say it's chitzim. Yesterday, when we still thought it was either or. But that principle still applies. Rabbi Yochanan still says this is intangible. If it's intangible, how can it be mammon? Or Rabbi Yochanan, you just said one daf ago that an intangible thing can't be yours. So the Torah regards it as yours. In that case, add it into the thing. Make a third one. Ask Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman. A great question of Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman. Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman doesn't answer it. To answer Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman's kasha, what is helpful is to flip the question. If you ask it the way Rabbi Yochanan formulates the question, it's very difficult to answer. The way we read it, it's very difficult to answer, and he doesn't answer it. But if you flip it, it's easier. If you flip it and you say, the question is not why was Eish not included on Daf Chavtet among the other two cases of where the Torah makes something that isn't yours, makes it yours. Eish should be included there as well. Let's flip the question. And let's say if Eish is Mishum Chitzov, why are you chayav for Eish? Because you did it. It was your action. It was a human action. Why not use the same principle by Bor and say you dug the Bor in Rosh Hashanah? There was an action there which was destructive, not an object that is destructive. An arrow is not destructive. An arrow lying on the table is not destructive. An arrow is destructive when you put it into your bow and you shoot. And the same with the bor. It's in Rosh Hashanah. It's the digging of the bor which was the problem. Why not include that with Eish? Why not treat it? Why do you have to say the Torah made bor as if it's yours? It's owned by you. Why do you have to get to that? Just say you dug the bor, you created the bor. That's an easier question, and then we can answer it in the following way. What is the fundamental? Let's get to first principles. What's the fundamental difference between Adam HaMazik and Mammon HaMazik? What's the difference between Adam and Mammon? That's why I started with people are my most valuable assets, and the difference between assets and people. People are about energy. They're about initiation. People initiate. Assets react. An asset can't initiate anything. An asset reacts. You can program it to do something. You can turn it on. A human has to act on an asset for an asset to react and then become productive. But a human doesn't have to wait to be acted on. And that's why managing people is so hard, because we've persuaded them over 100 years and more that they are assets. Sit there until I tell you what to do. When I tell you what to do, you'll do it because you're an asset. But if I would say to you, I'm hiring you because you're not an asset. I don't need you as an asset. I need you as a human. I need you to initiate productivity. I need you to initiate value creation. That's what humans do. In that case, what is Eish? Eish is also energy. So Eish is a continuation of human energy. I'm just using a tool. But it's applying my intellect and skills to the fire to extend the reach of my destructive capability using my energy. But Bor is static. Bor is sterile. A pit in the Rosh Hashanah, it's a hole. It's just a thing. It's an object. It's an asset, if you want to call it that way, a destructive asset, but it's an asset. It's an object. This can't be. This is not like chetz. Chetz, a bullet that I shoot out of my gun, an arrow that I shoot from my bow, fire that I set in motion. This is all a continuation of human energy, and therefore it's mishum חיציו. This is the human being who's damaged. There is no asset involved. But in the case of bor, it's an object. It's not my digging the bor that set something in motion. It didn't set anything in motion. Just created an object, which is an object of mazik. If it's an object, now the question is who owns the object. So by bor, the Torah has to put the ownership in my hands, whereas by Eish, the Torah puts the initiation, the ignition. But by Eish, what's important is the ignition, and by bor, what's important is the ownership, because bor is an asset and Eish is energy. And if it's energy, it's part of the human capacity. With that difference between the human and the asset, between Odom HaMazik and Shor HaMazik, we answer Rabbi Chonon's question. It becomes clear by flipping the question. What's interesting is that the Tosfos Chachmei Anglia also asked Rabbi Chonon's question. Tosfos Chachmei Anglia, by the time of the Baalei Tosfos, so we're talking about the 14th, 13th century, 12th century even, there were Baalei Tosfos in England. And in the Psochim Daf Vov, they asked the same question. V'kasher amay lo ka'amanami isho, shim natal she'enu b'ishuto v'idlikad isho chayav. Why is Eish not included on Daf Chav Tes and on Psochim Daf Vov? Rabbi Chonon didn't know that the Tosfos Chachmei Anglia asked the question, why not? Yes, 1970s, we discovered it. And Rabbi Yomi BAVA was killed in the Second World War, so he didn't know that his kasha was actually asked by the Balei Tosfos. And they answer it. He doesn't answer, but they do answer it. Now, the Balei Tosfos don't answer it the way we have, where we've answered it conceptually. The Tosfos Chachmei Anglia add a dimension to the answer we've just suggested. And the Tosfos Chachmei Anglia said, and you see that in the Posuk. So Rabbi Yomi BAVA asks, what's the difference between Bor and Eish? Why is Bor, you need bailus, you need ownership, and Eish is because of חיציו, it's a human energy. So we explained the difference between an asset and a human. Says the Tosfos Chachmei Anglia, that's fine, but it's even mentioned in the Posuk. יש לו מלאכין הכתוב קראו בעל, דכתיב בעל הבור. ובחמץ כתוב לא יראה לך, שלך. אבל גבי אש לא מצינו אלא ויצא אש. Look at the psukim, I've got them down below. What does it say in the case of Eish? Ki tetzei shmatzah kotzim v'nechal gadishu kama ha'osadeh. Shalem yeshalem. Who is responsible? Hamav'ir. It doesn't say Baal ha'esh. Hamav'ir. He who ignited it is responsible. What in the case of Bor? Ki yiftach ish bor, ki yichra ish bor, v'lo yichased v'nafal sham ashor chamor. Baal habor yeshalem. Doesn't say Korea habor or Poteach habor. He who opened it. It says Baal Habor. So you see in the Torah this distinction, which I've suggested in order to answer Rabbi Chonan's kasha. This distinction is actually made in the psukim, in the Torah. It's not made in the Gemara by the Rabbanan. It's actually in the psukim of the Torah that we see the distinction. And this idea of the difference between a human and an asset, that was foundational to the way my parents raised us. My father, I never heard my father articulate it in this particular way, but it was always that way. What value have you added? If we would be learning something, so what have you added? What's your chidush? What do you understand? And you couldn't just say stam chidush. You couldn't just say anything. He would then grill you. How do you know that's what it means? And couldn't it mean something else? And what is the hechrech? And do you have some kind of a raya? Do you have some kind of a proof? Is there a makor for it? Have you got a rishon? Have you got a mishnah? Have you got a gemara? Where does it come from? You can't just say stuff. But you have to have something, so we'll go back and work it more. And not just in learning, it was in everything, in every situation. What value are you adding? And wherever he and my mother went through their lives, the first thing they started doing was adding value. Right into their older age, when they came to California, they were already nearly in their 70s, and immediately my father in his 70s starts building a new community, building a shul, building a mikveh, building a beis din for that area, because there was nothing there like that in Northern California and the kind of San Francisco area. Now it's an important part of the world where all of the technology companies are. And that was just the beginning of that time. But Yiddishkeit was, there was nothing there, wasn't a school. So he built a school, he built a yeshiva, he built all in his 70s and the last years of his life. Because the idea of being somewhere, not being an Adam, not an Adam hamazik, but an Adam habore, an Adam, a human being who creates. You can create damage and you can create value. But you've got to be a creator. You're a shutaf with the Rebbeinu Shalom. You're a partner with the Rebbeinu Shalom. To be a human being who just sits in all of my father's shiurim and all the musa, that was always a theme. People would say sometimes, like, I just want to be happy. And my father would say, then be a cow. Cows are happy. They wander in the field. You're a human being. You're not always going to be happy. Do you want to be a human being and be creative and add value? Sometimes you'll be happy, sometimes you won't. Do you want to be a cow and you're always happy? That's the difference between an asset, between an animal, a shower, and a human being. And this idea that as humans we have incredible responsibilities. We're learning this in the Zikin all the time. It says, Rabbi Yehuda, man de boyle mevi chasidu. You want to be a chosid, learn the Zikin. Because you learn in the Zikin the difference between shor hamazik and odom hamazik. And by learning the difference between a human damage and asset damage, you learn the difference between human creativity and asset creativity. Assets can't be creative. You learn the responsibility of being human. And Adam Muad Lo'ilam, you learn that a human can never blame his actions on instinct, because we can override instinct. We can be intentional, we can be mindful, and we are responsible for everything we do. We don't have any excuses. That's what you learn when you learn the Zikin. And that understanding of what an Adam is, what a human being is something we take out of these Gemaras and we apply in our lives in a way that hopefully we can live and operate differently.